Okay, so symbolism and allegory, talking about these together, they work together. They just have little bit separate ways that they work inside of a story. And understanding these now as we're working in fiction will bleed over into poetry, because they're still the same. A symbolism in fiction, symbolism in poetry, symbolism in drama, they're the same. I mean, a symbol is a symbol. Allegory works the same as well. So what are these pieces and why are they in here? What do they do for us? They're tools, right? These are just more tools on the tool belt of the writer. They're different ways that the writers extend meaning, because sometimes you want to present ideas inside of your writing that are below the surface. So at some point in school, maybe at many points in school, you talked about there being depth. I mean, at some point in a reading course or in a writing course, you talked about looking for the main idea, right? And at some point, you probably talked about looking for implied main idea, because main idea is usually just sitting at the surface, like the main idea of this story or the main idea of this article. It's usually just sitting there for you to pluck right off of the surface. This article is about the problems of denuding the forests, or something like that. The problems with fluoride in the drinking water. Well, it's not always that easy when you're reading, and stories, especially in bigger, more in-depth articles and more in-depth research, is not always quite that simple, and the ideas are not always going to lay on the surface. So you have to learn as a reader to figure out all these little clues on how to start digging beneath the surface. So how do you figure that out? How do you figure out how to find what's beneath the surface? How do you even know where to start digging? I mean, it's like knowing that there's treasure underneath the ground in your backyard. It's like looking in your yard if you owned 100 acres and you know for a fact somewhere out in that 100 acres there's a treasure buried out there, but you only have a shovel and one chance to dig one hole in order to find it. So you better choose wisely. I mean, that's enough to drive somebody crazy. You get to dig one hole to find this treasure out in your 100 acres. Well, you would go nuts before you ever dug your first hole, right? Because how would you know? Well, you would have to think like a pirate, wouldn't you? You would have to think like the person that buried the treasure. You would probably go research every single thing that you could about the people that buried the treasure, so you could get into their head and think, well, where would they have buried it? What were they thinking when they did it? What were some of the landmarks that were here when they were here? Was this house here? Was this rock here? What else was here when they were here? So that you could start getting ideas about where could they or could they not have buried the treasure. So what's my point? My point is when you're trying to figure out meaning in a story, meaning in a song, meaning in poems, meaning in articles, meaning in research that's not sitting on the surface, like that treasure was not sitting on the surface, it was buried beneath. When we're trying to figure out deeper meaning that's not sitting on the surface of something, that's not sitting on the surface of a story, it's not sitting on the surface of a song, and we're trying to figure it out, we're trying to unbury it, which is what I'm trying to get you guys to do in this class. If nothing else, and you walk away and you forget all these stories and you forget all these authors and you forget all this stuff, I want you to at least be able to walk away understanding how to look at meaning beneath the surface. Because usually students come to me, and what you've been trained to do most of your life is to only pluck at meaning sitting on the surface. The moral of the story is whatever it told me at the surface of the story. I've been asking you guys to dig beneath it, which is why we've been learning at How do you look at character? How do I dig it out? How do I look at setting in a different way than it took place in June? I don't care about it taking place in June. What does it mean that it was June? Why did she set us up to be on a sunny day only to make it a horrible day instead of a beautiful sunny day in the afternoon, the sun is shining in the summertime? Usually bodes well for everything, but it didn't at all. It was a horrible day. So why the symbolism? The symbolism is used to extend meaning. So just like if you had 100 acres and only one hole to dig to unbury that treasure, just like you would want to know everything that you could and think like the pirate that buried the treasure, we're trying to think like the author. We're trying to think like the people that wrote the stories. And one of the things that we like to think about is their tools. How did they use their tools? What kind of tools do writers have at the ready? What kind of tools did they use? Well, one of the tools that they use to extend meaning is symbolism. So we're going to talk about how symbolism works so that you can recognize it in stories, and you can recognize it in poetry when we get there, and you can recognize it in the everyday things that you watch when you watch TV, you watch movies, you watch your shows, and you listen to music. Those kind of things, because you may never read literature again after this class if you don't want to, but you probably do listen to music, and you may very well watch movies. So there's symbolism everywhere, okay? It's in everything. And authors and writers, songwriters especially love symbolism and allegory. Oh my gosh. So you'll start looking for it, and you'll start noticing it everywhere. So I just noticed that the lawn guy just showed up. So I'm gonna apologize up front that you're probably going to hear some lawn noises, but we're still gonna carry on. So symbolism, what are they? They're modes that expand meaning. It gives space. Hang on one second, because actually it's about to get kind of loud. Okay, sorry about that. Thought I wouldn't be able to hear it, but it was there. Okay, so symbolism and allegory are both modes that expand meaning, right? So they're those tools that you're looking for that you would have to think about in order to find that extra meaning that would be placed in the story. So it helps you understand stories better. It helps you understand movies better. It helps you understand a song better. All those extra nuances that are inside of different things that you didn't even realize were actually there, but they are. That adds extra layers upon layers upon layers that you didn't even realize it. Sometimes when I'm teaching class in face-to-face, and so now even online, I'll refer to it as Shrek layering. So if any of you have ever seen any of the Shrek movies, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about, because whether or not you have little kids, because my kids are no longer little and have not been for a very long time, but I still like to watch Shrek once in a while if it pops on TV. And depending on it doesn't even matter what age you are, maybe you've seen Shrek. Next time it comes on TV, watch it. And even if you just watch it for 10 minutes, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. So if you have watched it with a little kid, or with an adult if you're now older and you watched it when you were a little kid, there's different layers to Shrek, right? There's a layer where a 5-year-old is laughing, and at the same time an adult is laughing. But often they're both laughing, but not at the same thing at the same time. They just both happen to be laughing for different reasons. And that's because the people who made the movie, in their infinite wisdom, which is very smart, wanted to be sure that they could keep the attention of both the little kid and the older person, older kid, adult, young adult, older adult, at the same time. Because if you can get everybody to enjoy it at different ages, they're more likely to sit there and watch it more than once. And I have seen Shrek, especially the first one and the second one, more than one time, and watched it long after my kids were grown and not wanting to watch it for little kid reasons. Kids think they're funny because they're green and they're big and they roll around and burp and other things and are muddy and have boogers. I don't know why little kids think they're funny, because I'm not a little kid, but adults think they're funny because they make adult jokes and have adult innuendos, which we'll get to later. And there's adult symbolism in there. There's a lot of symbolism and allegory inside of Shrek movies, which is very interesting. And a lot of jokes in there through symbolism and allegory that adults get. Adult type jokes through symbolism and allegory that the adults get, that the kids don't get, because they place it in there cleverly like that so the adults can enjoy it at a different level than the little kids. And then the little kids don't get it. And that's how you understand one day when your little kids are no longer little kids, when they start laughing at the exact same parts that you do. And you're like, whoa, wait a minute. So that kind of layering wouldn't be possible. That kind of deeper meaning, that kind of expanded meaning wouldn't be possible if we had to spell it out for you every single time. Oh my gosh, this is funny. The joke about Pinocchio because his nose is growing and it's made of wood and he said something about... Okay, so it wouldn't, first of all, it wouldn't be funny because you had to explain the joke. And then it's just not funny. If you have to explain the joke to somebody, if you've ever had to explain a joke to somebody, then it's not funny anymore, right? So if you have to explain everything to somebody, whether it's a joke or whether you're being sweet or whether you wrote a poem to somebody or it was whatever it was, if you have to explain it to them, then the symbolism is gone. It's just gone. Okay? I had to explain something to my husband not too long ago about something that I thought was like our song or something, and I was very excited about it. And I'm like, oh, they're playing it. Remember that? Our song, blah, blah. And he didn't remember it. And I have to tell you that it kind of ruined it. It just totally ruined it. So the symbolism was gone. It meant nothing. It meant nothing anymore. Because if it didn't mean something to both of us, well, it didn't mean anything to me. So needless to say, he has spent the last year and a half trying to rekindle that whole thing about that. Now he just keeps playing that song. And it's very sweet that he's trying to bring it back. But I'm like, I'm sorry, man. It's just dead. So the whole song thing, I'm like, I get it. But no, you didn't know what it was. So it's just gone. It's gone. Let it go. Symbolism can mean a lot to people. So if you have to explain it, then that expanded meaning has sort of been deflated. But when it works, it can really, 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 really add depth and depth and depth and depth. So I think you guys can see my mouse here. So depth means down, right? Instead of across. So we read going across, and you can only fit so many words going across this way, right? This is me trying to give you kind of a visual here. If you read going across, you can only write so many words going across a page. So allegory and symbolism, if you want to think about it this way, because we can only write so many words going across, and people only want to read so many words going across, symbolism and allegory add depth this way. One word could mean so many more things and have these layers and layers of thickness to it. The thing of it is, and what's cool about it, is once you start recognizing things being symbolic and allegorical, is now it adds this whole new level and layer to your worlds of songs and movies and everything. For you, that you're like, wow, I didn't even realize it's there. I don't want to start sounding like we're living in the Matrix or something weird like that, but it has these levels to it that maybe you just didn't really see before, and it's kind of cool. So it could have more flavor, so to speak, to things that you already were enjoying anyways, and now you can enjoy them to a whole different level, because before maybe you just were looking at things on the surface and just reading across and didn't even realize that underneath it there was all this depth that now you're going to be able to see. So they're literary devices. Both of these are literary devices, so tools, if devices isn't a word that you like to think of it, but it is a literary device. That's just a tool, if that helps you think about. They're literary devices, tools, developed for the from the connections that we, as readers, make between objects and occurrences. So how do things become sentimental to you, right? To one person, it's a spoon. To another person, it is their favorite object in the whole world because they found it on the day they found the love of their life. And it was the spoon they were eating with at the restaurant that they met their true love, right? So now that spoon means everything. To anybody else, it's a stupid spoon, all right? But we make connections to objects. I'm sure you all have, or most of you have, objects at your house or things that you've had for a long time that to somebody else, it's a simple, ratty looking stuffed animal, or it's just a cup. You know, I'm a cup person, so I have cups. I have coffee cups and cups in my cupboard that some of them mean nothing to me. You could throw them in the trash and I could really care less. But other coffee cups are my cups, and I bought them in places that we've lived when we were on deployment, and they mean something to me. And if you break them, you're in deep kimchi with me. So they feel irreplaceable. Obviously it's a cup and nobody's going to die, but except for maybe the person that broke it. But you know, there's things, they mean things to you. You may have a cheap piece of jewelry, but it means the world to you because your best friend gave it to you when you were 5. So we make these connections between objects and occurrences, or it could be something we've seen or something that's touched us, or, you know, so in stories it works the same way. And that's how symbols get made. That's how allegories get created. So we have to start recognizing them in stories, because we'll talk about symbols that are universal and contextual in stories. So merely bringing certain things to mind or speaking about them unlocks true meanings, implications, and consequences. So we'll talk about how that works inside of stories, because we are actually very symbolic as human beings. We already attach ourselves to items all the time. We can't help it. It's not even about ownership. It's really just about how we sometimes are very tactile in how we touch things, and we'll put our own feelings and emotions and memories and associate them with items outside of ourselves, that somehow that will keep those memories or feelings or occurrences or emotions locked forever in something outside of ourselves. It's an interesting just phenomena that is how we work as humans. So it makes sense that it works the same way in a story. So we already do it, but it also works that way in stories. But instead of just a thing, it could be a character or a setting or a whole long sequence of events inside of a story, which is what allegory is. So that's what we're talking about. The reference alone could be worth pages and pages of explanation and analysis. So when they say things like a picture is worth 1,000 words, well, a symbol is worth 1,000 words. An allegory is worth 1,000 words. So why do we even use these? Well, this is why. One reference alone can be worth pages of explanation and analysis. Well, some of it's because they don't want to write pages and pages and pages and pages. They could just use a symbol and help you understand depth. An piece of allegory and help say a lot of things. Also, they're saying here that writers or researchers can spend a lifetime researching one story, one piece of symbolism, one allegory. I mean, I wouldn't do that, but I'm just saying that other researchers could. trying still to analyze it and explain it. All right, so giving you kind of a visual on how symbolism works, especially since one of your journals are going to be on symbolism this time. So how does this work? This whole idea of symbolism. You can't just go around saying, yes, something is symbolic. This is symbolic. That is symbolic. Everything is symbolic. It's like, all right, calm down, calling everything symbolic. Because you have to be able to tell me something more specific than that. In fact, you should always be able to be more specific than that. Don't just go around saying things are symbolic. That sounds very fancy, but what does that mean? What are you saying is symbolic? So you have to say something specific is symbolic, right? Are your shoes symbolic? Is that what you're saying? What is symbolic? Something specific is symbolic. An object is symbolic. Miss Brill's fur is symbolic. Okay? A specific scene is symbolic. I'm picking on Miss Brill because it was one of the first stories we read and not likely to be something that you're still writing on. Miss Brill's fur is symbolic. The scene where the young couple makes fun of Miss Brill could be symbolic. So an entire scene can be symbolic of something. An entire character can be symbolic. Or some actions can be symbolic. So you have to tell me, first of all, what are you saying is symbolic? You can't just be like, oh yes, the story is symbolic. Something in the story is symbolic. The story has a lot of symbolism. It's like, it probably does. Now be more specific. What is symbolic? So that's step one. Step two is you need to say it is symbolic of what? What is it symbolic of? It can't just be a symbol. It needs to be a symbol of something. Because when you're telling me something is a symbol, that means you're saying it is a stand-in for something else. It is a representative of something else. It stands for what? And usually items or scenes or characters or actions, whatever, are often stand-ins or representatives of ideas or values, sometimes of other persons or ways of life. So we'll kind of go back to the idea of Miss Brill here. Miss Brill's fur could have been a symbol of, because a lot of people talked about her loneliness and all this kind of stuff. Some people said she was crazy. A lot of positive and negative feedback about poor Miss Brill. Her fur could have been a symbol of her values of what she kept, right? She clearly kept it for a long time. Could have been values of her old way of life, hanging on to her old way of life, right? She kept her old clothes. The fur was old. She clearly at some point had some money because she owned a fur, especially back when that story was written. It would have definitely meant that at some point she had some money because she owned a fur. And at that period, especially, that would have been a suggestion of a little bit of money, and that she had nice clothes at some point. But the fact was, by the time we're introduced to Miss Brill, her fur is tattered. It is old. It has lost its color. Its eyes are all messed up. Its nose is falling apart. She's trying to repair it before she puts the ratty old thing on. It's nasty. And her clothes are kind of tattered and old and out of date. So that kind of shows us that she had one time had nice clothing, but she had held on to it for a very long time and was still wearing it. So it kind of symbolized maybe her older way of life, like maybe what she used to have, or it could have showed us how she kept things that her old values, or that she was frugal and kept things still. It could have shown us how she's now doesn't have any money because she's clearly has not been able to purchase new items or repair her items. And a lot of you talked about her loneliness. So it could have personified or symbolized her loneliness, right? This whole idea that she was clearly lonely because she talked to it, at least in her head. She pet it like it was alive, and it's probably the only thing she directly spoke to and directly addressed it. You little rogue, or you old rogue, whatever she called it, like a pet name, and worried over it, fussed over it, and like I said, stroked it like it was a little dog or something. So it was the only thing that she had from beginning to end, and that she fussed over and worried about and made a connection with in the whole story. None of the people, she made no connection with any of the people, didn't worry about any of the people in the story really, or concern with them truly. More so with the fur was like the only thing that was truly close with her. It's really all that she had in a literal sense, in a figurative sense. So maybe that helped us understand her as a person in her way of life, or her values, or her ideas. So it just depended on where you wanted to go with that, how you wanted us to understand her. So it was an object with a lot of symbolism in it. People have written about the bench that she sits on, so that's an object that had ideas about it, and the fact that it was green, which some people say represents jealousy. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I'd go that far. It had to be a color, right? I mean, it's a bench. So sometimes a bench is just a bench, but it is what it is. So as you read on in these stories this week especially, you're going to see that there are a lot of objects and scenes, especially characters and actions in there that are going to absolutely be symbolic of other things, symbolic of other ideas, symbolic of values, symbolic of other people, and symbolic of ways of life. So you're definitely going to see that in there, specifically. I mean, these stories, not just from this week, but from weeks past, very specifically have a lot of symbolism in them. So you have to make sure that they have both of these pieces, and that's what this overlap, why the Venn diagram, the overlap is there. Because if you can't find it, if you're like, well, there was a part in the story where they talked about a flower, it could be symbolic of, and you can't really find one of these to cross over, well, it's probably not symbolic. So you have to think about that. So symbolism, it has to be a substitute for the elements being signified. So I just put a few of these up here because they're some of the big heavy hitters that we see all the time, right? That we recognize as major, what we'll talk about in a second, universal symbols, right? Our eagle, and with our colors on it, right? Red, white, and blue, the flag specifically. I mean, otherwise it would just look like a bird that somebody has painted graffiti on. We would be like, oh, who has defiled this poor bird? But really it's not, and if I was in a regular class, I would usually ask out loud what these things signified, and people would yell out things like freedom, patriotism, America, something. So it does have symbolic value to it. It's not just a bird or an eagle with weird colors on it. Random colors somehow appeared on it. It has symbolic meaning that goes beyond what it is, which is a bird with color on its wings. The symbolic meaning would be representative of freedom and America and patriotism and blah, blah, blah. And same with this, if we were saying literally what is it, we would say it's an old guy with a weird hat. That's what it is. It's some bearded old guy with a hat. right? Interesting sleeping attire, interesting choice. But symbolically, we know exactly what it is. It's Santa Claus, and it makes us think of things like the Christmas season, and gifts giving and family and the whole entire season, blah 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 blah. So we get this whole huge idea of an entire season associated with just one picture of an old bearded guy with a weird hat, right? So this as a symbol is a substitute for a lot of things, right? It's a very in-depth piece of symbolism. Same with a piece of jewelry, right? If the ring was on any other finger, or if it was on my right hand, then it would mean absolutely nothing at all. It would just be a sparkly adornment somewhere else. That's it. That's all it would be. A piece of metal and sparkly somewhere else. Who cares? Nobody cares. It would mean nothing. It would be an item. It would have no crossover. It would be over here, an object with none of this. But suddenly it's on my left hand, on my ring finger, and now we have this. Now I have an object, a specific object, a ring, on my ring finger, on my left hand. Suddenly we have values and a way of life, right? It signifies that have a commitment, that I am married, obviously in a commitment specifically that I'm putting out there, that this is what I'm saying. I am married, I am in a committed relationship, and all this kind of stuff. And that I'm making that known by wearing it on this hand and all that kind of stuff. It says a lot about me and everything. And it makes a lot of assumptions and puts it out there. So it has a lot to say about it and about the person wearing it, right? So we do have a lot of symbols that have a lot of pieces behind them that we already know and deal with on a daily basis. So what makes a symbol symbolic? It needs to have additional levels of meaning, obviously. It needs to have major ideas. It usually has some kind of emotions attached to it, like we were just talking about. They could be philosophical or religious qualities or values, something. There needs to be something else with it, like we were just looking at that diagram. So there's two types of symbols. The first one is called cultural or universal. I don't too often hear people call it a cultural symbol. They usually call it a universal symbol. So it just depends on what book you're reading or what class you're taking. They'll often use these two terms interchangeably. A universal symbol or cultural symbol means it's well known outside of a story. It's derived from our historical or cultural heritage, as in everybody knows what it is in general. That doesn't really truly mean that everybody knows what it is. But like these would be universal symbols. It's like, for the most part, we all know that the eagle and our flag colors, we know who Santa Claus is, and we know that, wearing a ring on your left ring finger means you're married. So these would be universal symbols, because we all here in the United States, we know what these symbols mean. We know what they are. So when we start seeing Santa Clauses show up in the Walmart, we're like, oh my God, we need to start thinking about Christmas. And I swear, if I see one before July 4th, I am going to be extremely distraught at the Walmart. So that better not happen. I can't even wrap my mind around that right now. So, if you work at Walmart, just warn them. Universal symbols. Derived from our culture and historical heritage, many symbols are generally or universally recognized. Now, interestingly, and this used to be out of one of our old books, interestingly, two of the pictures that were out of one of our old books are actually as representatives of universal symbols, actually Nobody in my classes usually recognizes them as universal symbols, which I thought was actually really funny, which is why I always put them in here. These usually everybody recognizes as universal symbols, which is why I do put them up there. And nobody ever knows these as symbols, which I keep them here so that then you do know them as universal symbols. Water is actually a universal symbol, and it's, if you think about it, you do kind of know that it is. Whether or not you're religious doesn't even matter. I'm not saying it doesn't matter, but it doesn't matter for the sake of understanding that water is a universal symbol, because even if you're not religious, I'm sure that you are familiar with the term baptism. And how do most religions baptize people? In some shape or form, they usually will use water. Yes? Some do full submersion, some do partial submersion, some just do a little drips of water. Same with christening, even if baby, whether it's baby or full adult baptism, there's usually water involved. Why? Because water cleanses your soul. Yes. Water washes your hands, right? We use water as a cleansing agent, literally and figuratively and religiously, right? Water is very important to us in many, many, many ways, both in a very real sense and in many different senses. So it doesn't seem too far-fetched then that it has become a universal symbol in everything, in what we write and even what we watch. They don't use water quite as often in movies anymore as they used to, but if any of you are fans of like old movies, pay attention next time you're watching any old movies, or if you accidentally are too bored to change the channel and an old movie comes on, pay attention to how much water is in them, or if there's water in them, because they used to actually use water a lot in old movies to be symbolic, especially to show like a change in emotion, or a change in, what am I trying to say? A change in tone in the movie. Like things have gone from calm to, there's trouble ahead. So suddenly there would be some weird scene change where there would be like calm water, and now there's like rapids, or the water's changing, or they would show sometimes a waterfall. They would show a waterfall to denote like violence almost. I'm trying to think of what movie I can remember where like a really rough scene was happening and there's like this waterfall beating down in the back. I actually think it was one of the original Superman movies with Christopher Reeves. There's like waterfall beating down in the background. So it's just weird sometimes. It's like waterfalls can be romantic, oddly, in the background, but almost violently romantic, oddly. Like overheated romance, if you get my drift. And then sometimes it's violence. Waterfalls can be violent, denote violence. So whitewater rapids, and it could be showing that there's turbulence ahead, so it's kind of a literal thing. But it's weird. Old movies really liked to use their water, and it was often where there was like romantic scenes, like couples sitting by the water or talking to each other by the water, having a picnic. There would always be this water next to them, which was very interesting. And you could kind of tell how the picnic was going according to how the water was. Yeah, I know. It was very peculiar. But a lot of stories will include water in them. And like I said, it's often recognized as a universal symbol. And if it's included in a story, like I told you before with the animals, it didn't accidentally get in there. It didn't rain in the story. Oh no, we were rained out and we decided to film anyways. It's not like that. So if it was written in there, it was written in there on purpose, like we talked about with the weather, right? Because water would be part of a weather condition and a condition of the area. Why would they write water into it? Why is it there? Why would they be talking about it? It might be symbolic, or they might have just needed some water in the story. So ask yourself why the water is there. This is a Greek mythology, or a mythological character. Now I'm trying to think if it's Greek or Roman. I think it's Greek. And it's actually a lot of universal symbols come from mythology. We get a lot of those, right? Like Pandora's box, and all that kind of stuff. Don't open up. Oh, now you've really opened up Pandora's box on that one. I mean, we say that a lot. It's a very popular saying, which is funny to me why the whole radio station where you can have all that stuff in it is called Pandora, because it's a very negative connotation. So it's interesting to me that they would name something so cool as the whole Pandora radio station something so negative like Pandora. But, that spread disease across all of humanity and created pestilence and horror for all of time. So I don't know why you would want to name your product that. Maybe they didn't know what mythology was. So mythology has been fading as far as something that they teach. They don't teach it anymore. They used to always teach it. If not in high school, they taught it in college. They don't teach it as much anymore. So it has been disappearing slowly off the maps of reading. As far as symbols go, we still have some of them, with more existing through comic books than anything, I think, at this point, but we still have some of them. But this was like a big one for a long time, which was, his name is Sisyphus, which nobody ever remembers the poor guy's name. And he's pushing a boulder up the hill. It was interestingly connected to Pandora, but that's a whole separate story. And part of his punishment for some of the things that he did, blah, 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 was pushing the boulder up the hill. And he has to push the boulder up the hill, and at the end of the day, it rolls back down, and guess what he has to do the next day? You are all so smart. He has to push it back up the hill again, and that is what he has to do for eternity. That was his punishment by the gods. So that's what he has to do forever. So it became kind of like a symbol of humanity. We use it all. It actually gets used a lot. If you start paying attention over the next few weeks, I bet that you'll notice it in some way, shape, or form somewhere, because they use it in a lot of things. They'll make references to it like, just keep pushing that boulder up the hill, or just keep pushing it up the hill, or it's an uphill battle. Sometimes is in a reference to this battle of him constantly having to always push the boulder back up the hill, like it was pointless. Like you always do it, but in the morning, it's that stupid boulder is right back at the bottom of the hill, and he has to push it back up the hill again. Oh my God, why does he keep doing it? It feels like the toil of man, right? Every day we have to get up and go to work, and it feels like the Monday through Friday thing. But it became like this symbol of, when people have lost hope, but you kind of have to keep going and just keep going, because something will change. And for him, something did change, and he eventually broke free of his eternity torment prison here. But it's kind of funny. I wish I would have written it down when I saw it. It was within the last 3 or 4 days. I was watching something on TV with my husband, and I can't remember what I was watching, but it was a lady, and she said something about her Sisyphean, oh my gosh, I can't even say his name, Sisyphean torment. And I'm like, normally you don't hear people say his name, because first of all, his name is Sisyphus. I can't say his name. Sisyphus, which is a weird name. So I don't hear his name very often. They usually just refer to rolling the boulder up the hill, stuff like that. Sisyphus. So it was interesting to hear his name actually said. But it was actually within the last few days that I heard somebody refer to him and his actual name. So it is still used as a symbol, interestingly. But there's songs about it that refer to it It's referred to, I've seen it in cartoons, like kids cartoons and comic strips in the newspaper back when they had those. And so it is still a symbol. They still use mythology in symbols, so it is there. So that's one type, universal. Universal means it didn't have to be in a story. We just talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 that weren't in a story. I didn't make you guys read a story about Santa Claus. You didn't read a story about wedding rings and defiled birds. And you didn't read a story about water or a story about Sisyphus. So we just talked about 5 different symbols that you didn't read a story that had anything to do with any of these. So universal symbols can exist outside of stories, okay? Because they're just generally known because they're so widespread. That's what a universal symbol is, okay? Now here's the second kind of symbol. It's called a contextual symbol. A contextual symbol is different because it only exists as a symbol inside of the story, okay? It became symbolic of something inside of the story. So going back to think about Miss Brill and her fur, the fur in Miss Brill was symbolic, absolutely. But it was only symbolic inside of the story. We don't normally go around thinking of furs as symbolic of loneliness, right? I mean, I'm sure that we think of furs in general at this point in time as symbolic of something. I don't even know if people still buy furs actually, but if they do, then they've become have negative connotations in a whole different way. But it doesn't have anything to do with loneliness. We don't go around and go, oh, that woman is wearing a fur, she must be lonely. That is not how we feel about furs in general. So the fact that we think of the fur as, being depicting loneliness, symbolic of loneliness, is only inside of the story of Miss Brill. It's only symbolic of loneliness inside of the context, which means the text, right? Inside of the context of that one story, which is why it would be called a contextual symbol. Its context means inside of a specific, inside of a specific context, inside of a specific zone of meaning, which in this case would be the story. And I put the lottery up here because it has the same problem, right? Inside of the lottery, first of all, there was the lottery. Normally, we think of the lottery as something positive. Yeah, I won the lottery. So I'm thinking that in that particular story, you don't want to win the lottery, right? I don't want to win the lottery in that town. If y'all do, then you might have some things you need to discuss. I don't. So in that particular story, the lottery itself has a different contextual symbol, right? It meant something negative in that case versus how the lottery is depicted to us universally, which universally the lottery is something good. I feel like I won the lottery, woo! But not in that story. Nobody was running around happy about that, obviously. I put the black dot here because normally when we all go around and see black dots, we don't feel a sense of dread or want to throw up or start picking up and piling up stones, for sure. But in the lottery, you can imagine that probably Dalmatians weren't popular dogs, and people probably didn't wear polka dots in that town. That's just my personal thinking on that, because every year the black dot, the black spot, was a mark of death. It meant you were going to die. Nobody wanted it. They were making a very big deal out of that in that story towards the end, and freaked out about it, scared to death of getting it, and waiting in horrible anticipation of being marked by it. So I'm thinking that the black spot became this horrible thing of worrying about getting, and this, it became symbolic of the mark of death on a family and then a specific family member. So I'm thinking black spots and so polka dots and stuff were not a popular item in the town, this particular town, but that is only a symbol inside of the story of the lottery. So it being a symbol of death is contextual. It only has bad meaning inside of the story, right? Contextual. When I go to Pier 1 and I see a box with black spots on it, I'm not going to go run screaming. If I see someone walking a Dalmatian, everyone in the dog park doesn't run away. So obviously this is not a universal symbol of death, right? It's just inside the story. So that's how contextual symbols work. So I think you can see that there's going to be some questions probably coming up coming up with some of these stories. Yellow wallpaper, obviously the biggest symbol in there would be, the yellow wallpaper. So was that contextual? Was that only inside the story that it was a symbol? Or when you go to Lowe's, do they not sell yellow wallpaper at Lowe's? I'm pretty sure they do. And if everybody felt that yellow wallpaper meant you were crazy and you're going to start talking to your wallpaper and feel like you're trapped in it, I don't think they'd probably sell yellow wallpaper at Lowe's. Lowe's would be like, no yellow wallpaper here, because everybody would be freaked out by it. So obviously it's a contextual symbol only, right? So, So that's what contextual means. It only exists as a symbol inside the story versus universal symbol. Everybody's aware of it and it's a symbol outside of a story, if that kind of helps. What is symbolic and what isn't? Sometimes that's going to be something you're going to have to figure out. Sometimes students see things in a story that I was like, well, I don't really see that as symbolic, but if you can sell me on it, well, then you can sell me on it. I have a friend that wrote something about a story that I did not see it as symbolic, but she did, and she sold me on it. I still would not have written a whole entire paper on that particular item in a story, but she did and was able to support it. So hey, good on her. Judge the importance that the author gives it if the element is prominent and maintains a constancy of meaning. So do you feel like it added to the story that you're talking about it as a symbol? Did it have some kind of specific purpose to be a symbol? Then cool. You can sell me on it. Just because I didn't feel like it was a symbol doesn't mean that it wasn't, because sometimes symbols have to do with how the reader perceives it. So that doesn't mean that it wasn't a symbol just because I didn't think that it was. All right. So let's talk about allegory. We're getting here. We're getting towards the end of this. Allegory and symbol are very similar to each other. The difference is that allegory is just kind of like, I want you to think of an allegory as kind of like a stretched out symbol. Okay? I know that's going to sound weird, and I have a couple more ways to explain this to you. If you're going to think about a symbol as just like a single piece or a single snapshot inside of a story, like, just the fur, or just the bench, or just, the wallpaper, a single item or a single piece inside the story that's symbolic, okay? That's why I'm saying it's a snapshot. It's a small piece inside the story that's symbolic. An allegory then would be almost like an elongated version of that. It's like a film strip, like a short video, so to speak. Instead of just a little snapshot, it's almost like you took a little short 3-second video inside of your story instead of just a short picture. That's how allegory works. It's kind of weird. So I'm gonna give you guys a better meaning here. Just give me a second. Oh gosh, I forgot that I did this. So this is gonna feel weird to you, and I'm sorry that I'm gonna explain it this way, but this has worked better the last few semesters than how I used to try to explain allegory. So, allegory, the actual definition of allegory says, allegory has a complete and self-sufficient narrative beneath it, which means there's a story. So allegory means there's a story, which there's always a story, and that on top of a story, there might be another story or chunks of story on top of it. Instead of just a symbol sitting on top of your story. Remember when we were talking about that depth a few lines ago? When I said, like, Shrek is like reading a line and then discovering that there's like depth underneath some of these pieces. Well, allegory, instead of just discovering that there's a little bit of depth underneath a couple of these pieces, allegory is like realizing that there's like long pieces underneath it. Like the whole thing has something on top of it. It's kind of weird. So let me give you a couple of examples. I don't know if any of you have ever had to read, and now I can't see you guys, which is the unfortunate part of this. So I can't tell if only one of you is going, yeah, I read that, or if all of you have, or if none of you even know what I'm talking about. It's the only bad thing about online is I can't tell. So I'll give you a couple of examples, hoping that this reaches out, or at least that when I give you this example, I can explain it well enough that even if you didn't read this, it'll still make sense. A lot of people, when you're in school, had to read Animal Farm. So maybe some of you had to read it, and maybe some of you didn't. So for those of you who had to read it, you know what I'm talking about. For those of you that did not have to read Animal Farm, I will just say to you very simply, it was a story about some animals on a farm. And I'm not joking. Okay? At its core, at its simplest core, it was a story about some animals on a farm. And it was called Animal Farm. And in that story, the animals could talk, right? They were characters in the story. And some of them liked the others and some of them didn't. They broke up into groups, and there were leaders of this group, group 1 and group 2, and some were mean and some were nice, and they got into fights with each other in the two different factions, and they went to war with each other. Okay? And it was brutal. So that's kind of the basics. That is literally the basics, okay, of the story. Animals on a farm, split into factions, went to war with each other. So now you know what it was, regardless if you read it or not. So that is the story Animal Farm. So if you had to read it in school, depending on what level of class you took and what kind of school you went to, that may have been all you knew about it. So we're going to say that this book represents the book Animal Farm. Okay? And let's say you took just a regular class, not like college prep or anything like that. It was just a regular class. And you read the book Animal Farm. This is the book Animal Farm. It is a complete and self-sufficient narrative, as in it is a complete story. From front to back, it started at the beginning. It was a story about animals on a farm that had different personalities, split into factions, and went to war with each other, and things happened. It got brutal and ugly and bloody, and then it ended. Ta-da! It is a story. All right? Hopefully you're with me so far. That is a story about Animal Farm. Now, here's where the allegory comes in. We haven't gotten to the allegory yet. This is just the story. This is just the self-sufficient narrative, all by itself, the story. If you took a college prep class or an honors class or whatever they call them now. When I was in school, we didn't have those. It was college prep and honors. So there was no such thing as AP. So in the college prep and honors classes, when we read Animal Farm, once we were done reading Animal Farm the first time, which it just looked like this. We then came back through and talked about the allegory of Animal Farm. So, sorry, I have to laugh at my stupid ghost. So we're going to think about allegory as this kind of invisible ghost that exists on top of the book. The book is still there. The story of Animal Farm is still there. And if you never, ever did anything else with the story, you still would have walked away understanding the entire story of Animal Farm. The animals on the farm that got in a fight and you walked away, okay? And the classes underneath my class, that's exactly what happened. If you weren't in the college prep and honors classes, they never went on to part 2. They just read the book, talked about how the animals acted and didn't act, and they went on to the next thing and they were done. But the classes, the college prep and honors classes, we went on to talk about the allegory. So for any of you who did read Animal Farm, and even now those of you who didn't, and I just tortured you with telling you about it, the allegory is this extra weird story on top of the story. And that story was that the story Animal Farm was actually an allegory, which is just a really, really, really long symbol for the Russian Revolution. The whole entire story of Animal Farm is kind of like a stand-in for the Russian Revolution. So the characters in Animal Farm have like characters that they stand for that were like main people that were in the Russian Revolution. And a lot of the big events that happened in Animal Farm were supposed to signify main events that happened in the Russian Revolution, okay, as seen by the author. So you're supposed to be able to come out of the other side of reading Animal Farm as a student with some kind of an understanding of the Russian Revolution by having read Animal Farm. Now, if nobody ever told you that Animal Farm was an allegory for the Russian Revolution, you would never know that. How in the heck would you know that? It's not like it tells you that. And if nobody ever told you that, and you never knew that, you would never ever have this extra ghost on top of it, right? You would never get this allegory that existed on top of this book, right? It signifies another series of conditions or events. So, before the ghost, it has a complete self-sufficient narrative. That's the story of Animal Farm. But it also signifies another series of conditions and events. And in this case, it was the Russian Revolution. If you never understood that, it didn't matter. You still would walk away with knowing what Animal Farm was. If any of you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, or watched the Narnia movie, you also experienced allegory, right? You could have watched the whole movie and just been like, oh, that was cool. This whole thing about Narnia, cool. Or you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and you're like, cool, I like the story. It was neat. All by itself, complete self-sufficient narrative. Or you understood that in big chunks, not the whole entire thing. It wasn't like Animal Farm where the whole thing was a one, basically page 1 to page end, beginning to end. But it had big chunks of allegory that signified another series of conditions or events. It was a Christian allegory. So it had big pieces of signifying Christian events in there, right? Aslan came to help them when they needed help to guide them on their way, and then he died and they were very sad and they put him off to the side and he went away. Then 3 days later, he rose again. Starts to sound familiar to you, right? So there was like a lot of biblical references in it, Christian biblical references in it. So it is it's by a Christian writer. It has a lot of Christian allegorical pieces in it. Purposely, it was written that way on purpose. So, but if you didn't know that, maybe you missed them. If you don't care about that, it doesn't matter. You still have the book underneath it, right? Beowulf, very strange, bizarre, long, kind of cool. Monsters fighting. Also considered one of the first big Christian allegories. So there's tons of them out there. Alice in Wonderland, very cool story, bizarre. Seemed like he was doing drugs. I don't think that he was, but I don't know. It's a weird story. Love it. The Disney version, any version, the real version especially. But it's actually extremely political. So even though it's not beginning to end, there's all sorts of allegorical chunks in it. So not one big ghost, lots of little ghosts throughout it. Symbolism, absolutely. But a little allegorical pieces in it also, right? Queen of Hearts, like Queen Mary, the off with their head thing, and mocking her and how she acted, and her husband and their relationship and how they ran the country. He had a lot of political misgivings and things that he couldn't say at the time, so he wrote them in children's books, which was kind of weird for politics, but it is what it is. So lots of political allegories and things in there. So I mean, it exists in a lot of things that we read and a lot of things that we do. There's a lot of allegorical pieces in a lot of things. So it's the ghosts on top of the story. That's kind of what I'm trying to get at. Sometimes there's this invisible extra series of events and conditions that they're trying to get across to you on top of the story that you're reading, that's giving you its own narrative that you're reading. That's what allegory is. I hope that helped a little bit. I know allegory is very difficult to get across to people sometimes because it's peculiar and it's just its own thing. Okay. I think this is just a different visual representative of exactly what I just said. So a story is all by itself. Like if this was Animal Farm, this pink film piece would be the story. It's all by itself. Animal Farm, you could read it from beginning to end and you'll get just as much out of it. And then there was this whole entire thing about the Russian Revolution on top of it. Or this whole film piece could be Alice in Wonderland. And underneath Alice in Wonderland, there are these fragments of political allegories underneath it. So it just depends on what you're reading and what types of allegorical chunks there are in it. Okay. Allegory is often concerned with morality and religion, but you can also find politics and social allegories because Alice in Wonderland was more about politics and social allegory. It may be considered allegorical even if the author didn't plan it that way. There are some allegory stories that the author's like, oh, I didn't think it was an allegory. I didn't make it, allegorical, but yet it is. So supposedly some of them were by accident. People assigned the allegory later. As long as the parallel connections are close and consistent, you can say it was an allegory. Obviously, it can't all of a sudden change, and the main character can't all of a sudden go from a good thing into a bad thing and you say it's an allegory. It's more than a literary tool. It has become a favorite method of teaching morals, and we use them all the time. So some of the most familiar allegories that you probably are very familiar with would be fables, like Aesop's fables, which always end in a moral. The moral of the story is jealousy can be poisonous. Don't be jealous of your friends. Be kind to your neighbors, right? Aesop's fables are always end with a pointed moral. Fairy tales are actually probably the most popular and obvious of allegories because while they're telling us the story of a princess meeting Prince Charming or something like that, they're also trying to teach us a lesson. So all fairy tales, at least the Grimm version of fairy tales anyway, sometimes the Disney version loses the allegory. Probably the most obvious version that lost its allegory would be The Little Mermaid. The Little Mermaid lost its allegory. The rest of them kind of kept them intact. Little Red Riding Hood, it's a full story. We'll go back to our ghost. It's a full story by itself, right? We can read the whole thing with the little girl and her mom, and her mom makes her little red hood, and she wants to go, and her mom, all these conversations that they have. So you get the whole conversation and the family and the hood and the basket and the grandma and all this kind of stuff. But on top of this colorful story about the family and the knitting and the hood and all this stuff, you have this allegory about stay on the path, don't talk to strangers, listen to your parents, right? So you have these extra warnings, which are the allegory on top of it, which is how fairy tales work, right? That's how a lot of fairy tales work. Parables and myths are the same. So parables are religious stories. So if it, like the prodigal son, right? You have the whole story beneath it, which are how Bible stories are. There's always a story underneath it of what's happening. Same thing, but on top of it, there's always a lesson to be learned. Family comes first, or don't treat your neighbors this way, and all this kind of thing. So it's very similar. There's a story underneath it, but it's also trying to teach you a lesson. Okay, I just said all that, so I'm not going to say it again. I think this is the last slide on this one. So last slide. Let me check. Ooh, it is. So allusion. So this is the last piece of this part of it. So allusion is this last snippet that is part of symbolism and allegory. And it could be part of this whole idea of cultural and universal symbols and allegories, because what they'll often do is allude to other works from our cultural heritage. So it could be anything. It could be biblical, it could be ancient history, it could be literature, other works of British and American tradition, and quite honestly, it could be anything from now. It could be, we actually do it all the time. It could be pop culture. So sometimes understanding a story may require knowledge of history, current politics, and pop culture understanding too. So it's easier if you understand pop culture, which you're probably going to because it's in the now. It's more difficult if it's referring to older things or more literary pieces or historical pieces, because then you may not understand it, which is, by the way, part of the reason that when you're in college, you get a liberal education. It's called liberal arts education. It's part of your undergirding of any of your bachelor's degrees, because that's all this. That's so you end up with those parts that you can kind of refer back to. So you have a general understanding of the basics of science, the basics of history, the basics of literature and history and all that, so that you can understand these allusions, so you can understand these references, and you can understand the basic workings of these basic knowledge bodies of knowledge that all kind of work together and are knitted together, because they do work together as one piece. And an allusion would be, interestingly enough, and maybe sadly enough, I see them the most, I want to say, in like current stuff, in SpongeBob, Family Guy, and South Park. Those are like the three worst things that I never thought would come out of my mouth, but it's true. They make allusions all the time, both current pop culture allusions and older allusions to literature, history, and everything, where they'll say something, they'll be talking and they'll say something about, oh, so you write one paper and you think you're Shakespeare? That's an allusion. If you didn't know who Shakespeare was, you wouldn't understand that they were making a joke. You wouldn't even know what they meant by that. So, or they would say something like, someone has a raven on their shoulder and they're like, what, now you think you're Edgar Allan Poe? Or maybe they're walking around and their hair is long and they'll say, what, you need a robe and now you think you're going to go around and, oh, I forgot what I was going to say. I just totally lost my train of thought. Somebody just walked in the house. Oh, the Romeo and Juliet thing. So we kind of misuse Romeo and Juliet all the time. Well, and in songs they even misuse it. So if you really truly know the story of Romeo and Juliet, there's a reason why it's called a Shakespearean tragedy, because it's a tragedy. It's a very negative story, and the whole thing is awful. And you don't ever want somebody to refer to a couple as Romeo and Juliet, because it's really horrible. The whole thing was horrible, and rash. Their whole beginning to end, their actions were unfortunate, and oh wow. So anyway, it's a very negative piece of work, and connotations are all negative. So if people really truly understood pieces of it, I don't think you would ever really truly want to associate yourself in a relationship with Romeo and Juliet ever. So it's very interesting that we misuse that all the time. So anyway, we make references to these things all the time. So if you don't know what they are, and you don't understand pieces of basic history and pieces of basic science and pieces of basic literature, then you miss out on all of these allusions. So an allusion is when you borrow from something and you're like, ooh, he does that. Now you look like Frankenstein. So it's like we get the pop culture references, right? So if you say someone looks like Frankenstein, that's very negative. You're alluding to something that we all know what it is. Frankenstein is a monster. So it's obviously not saying something very nice. But what if they start saying references that are beyond what you understand? Now you don't know if they said something positive or negative. So what do? Are you just like reading something and you just go over it and you're like, well, I don't know what that was, so I'm just going to keep reading? That's when now you're going to start stopping and you're going to look it up, because now you're in college. So what you should be doing is, when you come across things that you don't know, especially when you're reading and they're making an allusion to something else, or you're watching TV and they're making an allusion to something else, unless you're in the movie theater, obviously, you should take the time to figure out what it is. Because what if it's key to you understanding what the whole thing is about? Because it could be. So that's why you read these things. That's why we read these stories. That's why I try to give you a little bit of a taste of some of the kind of big names in the lit pieces. And that's also why I'm trying to teach you to dig beneath the surface, so you can start understanding these allusions, these allegories, these symbols, to kind of give you a richer way to see things and to hear things that are just part of your everyday world.